The sky over Frontier Station 7 did not merely darken. It bruised, turning a sickly, electric violet that signaled the arrival of an iron dust screamer. These storms were the legends of the northern peaks, capable of stripping the hull from a freighter or freezing a man's lungs before he could draw a final breath. Jake knew the rhythm of this hostile world better than most. He had spent 20 years carved out of the silence, building a life from salvaged timber and the deliberate choice to be forgotten. As the first gust of wind nearly upended him while he was securing the woodpile, he didn't curse the sky. He simply respected the power of the freeze. He retreated toward his cabin, the reinforced polymer door groaning on its hinges, as he fought the atmospheric pressure to seal himself inside. He expected a night of solitude, the crackle of a thermal hearth, and the bitter comfort of a strong brew. He did not expect the rhythmic, heavy thudding against the airlock that followed an hour later. It wasn't the sound of debris or the wind playing tricks on his mind. It was the frantic, heavy pounding of armored gauntlets. When Jake cracked the manual override, the warmth of his home was instantly sucked away by a predatory vacuum of ice. Standing there, hunched against the gale, were 5 figures that seemed to have been forged from the storm itself. They were tall, impossibly lean, and draped in adaptive mesh combat gear that glinted with a layer of frozen silver. Their presence was immediate and overwhelming, filling the small entryway with a sharp, metallic scent of alien biology and ozone. The leader of the pack stepped forward, her crest feathers, usually a proud display of her Vin heritage, plastered flat against her skull by the frozen rain. Her eyes were amber, glowing with a fierce, predatory focus that scanned Jake not as a man, but as a tactical variable. She spoke in an accent that was thick but precise, her voice cutting through the howl of the peaks like a serrated blade. "Shelter," she demanded, though the word was softened by the promise of a credit transfer. In the frontier, no one turned away a traveler during a screamer, not even if they were apex hunters from the Talon systems. Jake stepped back, gesturing them into the amber glow of his living quarters. As they filed past him, the cabin suddenly felt claustrophobic. The Vin were a species of hunters known across a dozen sectors for their lethal grace. These were all female, a typical hunting pack, moving with a synchronized fluidity that suggested a shared consciousness. They didn't just walk into the room, they occupied it, fanning out to secure the perimeter even as they shivered from the bone-deep cold. Their heights ranged from 6.5 to nearly 7 feet, their heads nearly brushing the timber rafters Jake had hewn by hand. As they began to shed their outer pressurized cloaks, the iridescent sheen of their feathers caught the firelight, shimmering with colors that didn't belong in such a gray wasteland. The leader explained their predicament: a grounded shuttle 2 valleys over, and a miscalculation of the storm's velocity. They needed 6 hours of heat. Jake, trying to settle the sudden spike of adrenaline in his chest, moved toward the galley. He offered coffee and rations, a gesture of hospitality that seemed to catch the leader off guard. Her crest rose just a fraction, a sign of genuine surprise. He focused on the task, the familiar routine of grinding beans providing a shield against the intense gaze of 5 predators. Behind him, the silence was replaced by the clicking, musical language of the Vin. It was a beautiful, haunting sound, but Jake's ears were sharp. He had spent years studying the nuances of frontier tongues to survive, and he caught enough to understand that he wasn't just a host. One voice, younger and sharper than the rest, cut through the musical hum. "I saw him first," she whispered in her native tongue, but the intent was universal. The air in the cabin, already tense, seemed to crystallize. Jake didn't turn around, but he felt the shift. It wasn't the cold from outside, it was the heat of acclaim. The leader, Kira, responded with a firm, low tone, reminding the younger one that the door had opened for the entire pack. But the younger Huntress, a bronze-feathered scout named Hia, didn't back down. She moved closer to the kitchen, her presence looming over Jake as he poured the steaming liquid. He handed out the mugs, his hand steady despite the predatory dynamics playing out in his living room. Vex, the eldest of the group, took her drink with a silent nod. She was a veteran, her feathers scarred and muted, her eyes carrying the weight of 100 campaigns. She seemed to be the anchor, watching the interplay between the younger Huntresses with a weary kind of amusement. Hia remained uncomfortably close to Jake, her amber eyes tracking the movement of his pulse as he drank. She asked if he lived alone, if he had a mate, her questions pointed and devoid of the usual social fluff humans used. Kira challenged the scouts' forwardness, but it was clear that a hierarchy was being established. They spoke of territory and pack etiquette, debating Jake's status as if he were a rare specimen discovered in the deep brush. He realized then that to them, a baseline human living in total isolation was a curiosity, a prize of genetic purity. He told them he had no mate, no pack, just the trees and the silence. The green-feathered huntress among them seemed moved by this, calling it a lonely existence, but Jake corrected her. There was a difference between being lonely and being alone. He had chosen this solitude to escape the noise of the crowded core worlds. As the hours ticked by and the storm hammered at the shutters, the conversation shifted from survival to something deeper. They found his collection of physical books, a rarity in an age of digital ghosts. When the silver-feathered huntress, LRA, discovered his copy of Vin Meditations in the original script, the dynamic changed again. He wasn't just a specimen anymore. He was a bridge. They talked about philosophy and the ethics of the hunt, comparing the human drive for expansion with the Vin's devotion to the balance of the ecosystem. Jake found himself relaxing, drawn in by the sharp intelligence of his guests. They were soldiers, yes, but they were also thinkers, shaped by a culture that was ancient when humans were still huddling in caves. Yet, the undercurrent of the claim never fully vanished. LRA eventually explained the protocol to him, perhaps out of a sense of fairness. Among the Vin, declaring interest in a mate was a formal act that allowed for challenges from the rest of the pack. She wanted him to understand the rules of the game being played in his own home. Jake, setting his mug down, met their eyes with a calmness that seemed to startle them. He wasn't afraid of their strength. He told them plainly that he wasn't territory to be claimed by whoever saw him through a doorway. Interest, he argued, required a foundation of knowledge, not just a predatory impulse. This rejection of their standard protocol wasn't met with anger, but with a profound, thoughtful silence. Vex showed her approval with a subtle rise of her crest. She respected a being who stood his ground. Kira apologized with a grace that was as sharp as her blades, admitting that the cold had perhaps clouded her judgment. They spent the rest of the night not as hunter and prey, but as travelers sharing a fire. When the dawn finally broke, painting the fresh snow in shades of gold, the Vin prepared to depart. Their shuttle was back online. Kira was the last to leave. She stood in the doorway, the freezing air ruffling her bronze feathers, and asked if she could return, not as a hunter making a claim, but as a person interested in a conversation. Jake smiled and told her to bring good coffee. As he watched them vanish into the white expanse, the cabin felt quiet once more, but the silence no longer felt like the end of the story. The weeks following the storm were the quietest Jake had ever known, though the silence had a different texture now. It was no longer the heavy, stagnant stillness of a man hiding from the galaxy, but a pregnant pause, like the indrawn breath before a song begins. He spent his days repairing the damage the iron dust screamer had done to his exterior sensors and hauling fresh meltwater from the creek. Every time the wind whistled through the jagged peaks of the northern range, he found himself glancing toward the horizon, half expecting to see the shimmering adaptive mesh of a Vin hunting cloak. He told himself he was just being cautious, but the extra chair he had pulled out from the storage closet suggested otherwise. He had scrubbed the cabin until the scent of wet feathers and ozone had faded, replaced by the familiar aroma of pine resin and wood smoke, yet the memory of those amber eyes remained etched into the shadows of his rafters. The return happened on a Tuesday, during the fall spring, when the sun finally had enough bite to turn the permafrost into a slick, treacherous mud. There was no desperate pounding this time. Instead, a low-frequency hum vibrated through the floorboards, the unmistakable signature of a high-end Talon-class shuttle dropping out of silent running. Jake stepped onto his porch, wiping his grease-stained hands on a rag. The vessel was a sleek sliver of obsidian, hovering inches above the slush on repulsor lifts. When the ramp hissed open, a single figure emerged. It was Kira. She wasn't dressed in the heavy, aggressive combat plating of a pack leader this time. She wore a tailored flight suit of deep charcoal, her iridescent bronze feathers groomed to a high sheen that caught the morning light like polished metal. In her primary hand, she clutched a vacuum-sealed canister marked with the sigil of a high-end off-world roastery. She stopped at the base of his porch steps, her posture formal, her crest held at a neutral, respectful height. She didn't move with the predatory entitlement of their first meeting. There was a tentative quality to her grace, a deliberate softening of her edges. The frontier air was still biting, but she didn't seem to notice the cold. She held up the canister like an offering. "I am told this is the finest roast in the Orion Arm," she said, her voice lacking the serrated edge of command. "It took 3 system jumps to acquire. May I enter, or is the territory closed to travelers today?" Jake felt a slow smile tug at the corner of his mouth. He stepped aside, gesturing to the door he had built with his own calloused hands. "The coffee is an excellent start, Kira. Come in." Inside, the cabin felt larger with only 2 inhabitants, but the energy was twice as dense. As the water began to boil, the silence between them wasn't awkward. It was a space they were both learning how to navigate. Kira moved to the bookshelf, her fingers hovering just inches from the spines, showing a restraint that hadn't been there before. She asked about the history of the books, about the Earth that Jake had left behind, not the Earth of the history vids, but the one of smell and sound. He told her about the rain on the Appalachian Trail, and the way the air felt before a summer thunderstorm, things that were impossible to find on a pressurized station or a barren frontier world. In return, she spoke of the Talon systems, of the great floating aeries where her people lived among the clouds, and the rigid social structures that dictated every breath a Vin took. She confessed that her claim during the storm wasn't just about him. It was a reaction to the sudden, jarring freedom of the frontier, a desperate attempt to apply the rules of her home to a place that had none. Their conversation was interrupted by a sharp, staccato chirp from Jake's long-range scanner. It wasn't a weather alert. It was a proximity alarm, tuned to detect the specific heat signatures of unauthorized atmospheric entries. 3 blips appeared on the screen, moving fast and low through the canyons. Kira's crest snapped upward, her amber eyes narrowing into slits of pure tactical instinct. "Those aren't Vin signatures," she hissed, her hand instinctively moving to the empty holster at her hip. "They're scavenger drones, the kind used by the Syndicate to track high-value salvage. Or high-value targets." Jake felt the old coldness return to his gut, the reason he had moved this far out in the first place. The Syndicate didn't care about borders or hospitality. They cared about the fact that a baseline human with a clean genetic record was worth a fortune on the black market, and a rogue Vin leader was worth even more. The drones were just the vanguard. Behind them, a heavy-lift transport began to descend, its shadow blotting out the sun as it settled into the clearing. The Syndicate had found the shuttle's signature, and they weren't here for coffee. Jake looked at Kira, and for a heartbeat, the Huntress and host dynamic vanished entirely. They were 2 beings in a box, surrounded by a universe that wanted to put them in cages. "We can't hold the cabin against a breach team," Jake said, moving toward a hidden floor safe beneath the rug. But I didn't spend 20 years out here without a backup plan. He pulled out a pair of pulse rifles and a crate of proximity mines he'd been saving for a rainy day. Kira took the rifle with a practiced ease, the weight of the weapon bringing back the lethal shimmer to her feathers. "You said interest requires a foundation of knowledge," she whispered, checking the power cell. "Let's see how well we work together when the storm isn't made of ice." The first Syndicate breach team hit the perimeter sensors 60 seconds later. The cabin, once a sanctuary of peace, transformed into a fortress of choke points and kill zones. Jake took the high window, his breath steady as he lined up the sights on the lead scavenger. Beside him, Kira moved like a shadow, her biological cloaking engaging as she prepared to slip out the back to flank their attackers. "I saw him first," boast of the younger Huntress felt like a lifetime ago. Now, there was no talk of claims or territory. There was only the rhythmic thud of pulse fire, and the shared understanding that if they survived the next hour, the conversation over coffee was going to be much, much longer. The frontier was indeed full of possibilities, but as the first door charge blew, Jake realized that the best ones were the ones you had to fight for. The roar of the breaching charge was followed by a silence, so brief, it felt like the world had forgotten to breathe. Then, the front door, the one Jake had spent 3 months reinforcing with iron bark and scrap steel, didn't just open, it disintegrated into a hail of splinters. The Syndicate didn't use soldiers, they used reclaimers, bio-augmented thugs who were more machine than man, designed to take what they wanted and leave nothing behind. 2 of them charged through the smoke, their heavy boots thudding against the floorboards with a weight that made the foundations groan. Jake didn't hesitate. From his position behind the heavy oak table he had flipped for cover, he squeezed the trigger of the pulse rifle. The first shot caught the lead scavenger in the chest, the kinetic energy throwing the man back into the freezing mud outside. The second scavenger was faster, diving behind the wood stove and returning fire with a subsonic shredder that tore through Jake's favorite chair as if it were made of paper. Where was Kira? For a terrifying second, Jake thought she had used the chaos to escape, to save herself and her expensive shuttle. But then he saw it, or rather, he saw the lack of it. A shimmer in the air, a ripple like heat rising off a summer road, drifted down from the rafters. Kira didn't use a gun. She used the environment. She dropped from the ceiling like a falling star, her monomolecular blade extending from her wrist gauntlet in a blur of silver. The scavenger behind the stove never even had time to scream. In one fluid motion, she bypassed his armor and neutralized the threat, her movements so fast they were nearly impossible for the human eye to track. She stood over the fallen man for a fraction of a second, her bronze feathers flaring in a display of pure, unadulterated aggression, before she turned her amber eyes toward the doorway. "There are 4 more outside," she shouted over the hiss of the storm and the crackle of fire. And they brought a heavy ordnance walker. Jake felt a cold sweat break out on his neck. A walker meant they weren't just here for a kidnapping. They were here to level the site and pick through the remains. He grabbed the crate of proximity mines and slid them across the floor to Kira. "Set these at the side vents," he commanded, his voice dropping into the low, steady tone of a man who had faced death more than once. "I'll distract the pilot." He didn't wait for her to agree. He sprinted toward the back of the cabin, through the kitchen where the coffee they had just brewed was still steaming on the counter. He climbed the ladder to the loft, kicking out the small ventilation window that looked over the clearing. The Syndicate walker was a spindly, 4-legged monstrosity, its turret swiveling as it searched for a heat signature. It was built for the vacuum of space, but it was clumsy in the thick, treacherous mud of the frontier. Jake aimed for the hydraulic fluid lines on the front leg. It was a 1 in a million shot, but he had lived on this planet for 20 years. He knew exactly how the gravity and the wind liked to play with a pulse slug. He fired. The blue bolt of energy streaked through the air, clipping the line and sending a spray of glowing green fluid onto the snow. The walker tilted, its turret firing a wild burst of plasma that melted a hole in the cabin's roof. Above the roar of the machinery, Jake heard the telltale click beep of the proximity mines. Kira had been busy. A massive explosion rocked the side of the house, followed by the screech of metal as the scavenger transport's landing gear buckled. The Huntresses weren't just graceful, they were efficient. Kira reappeared at the base of the loft ladder, her face smeared with soot but her eyes brighter than he had ever seen them. "The transport is disabled," she called out. "But they've sent an emergency distress signal. Their packmates will be here in 20 minutes. Jake climbed down, his lungs burning from the smoke. "We can't be here when they arrive," he said, looking at the ruins of the home he had built with his own hands. "The Syndicate doesn't stop. They'll send a destroyer next time." Kira walked over to him, her breathing shallow and fast, the adrenaline still coursing through her system. She reached out, her clawed hand resting gently on the shoulder of his jacket. "Then don't be here," she said softly. "My shuttle is still flight capable. The Talon systems are a long way from the Syndicate's reach." "You said you weren't territory to be claimed, Jake. But perhaps you could be a guest in my territory?" He looked around at the splintered wood, the broken books, and the cooling coffee. He had spent his life running towards solitude, only to find that the most dangerous thing about being alone was having nothing left to lose. The sound of more engines echoed in the distance. The reinforcements. Jake looked at Kira, the bronze-feathered huntress, who had started this day as a ghost from his past, and was now his only hope for a future. He realized then that the claim wasn't about ownership, it was about recognition. She didn't want a specimen. She wanted a partner who could stand in the middle of a storm and not flinch. He grabbed his old leather pack, the one he had arrived with 2 decades ago, and stuffed a few charred books inside. "Keep the coffee warm," he said, glancing at the obsidian shuttle waiting in the mud. "I think I'm ready to see those Ares in the clouds." As they ran for the ramp, the first of the Syndicate reinforcements cresting the ridge, Jake didn't look back. The cabin was just wood and stone. The frontier, he realized, wasn't a place on a map. It was the space between two people who refused to be caught. The slipstream transition didn't feel like movement. It felt like being pulled through a needle's eye. For several agonizing seconds, the universe was nothing but a scream of white noise, and the crushing weight of physics trying to undo the bond of their atoms. Then, the pressure vanished. The obsidian shuttle drifted into the silent, velvet dark of a star system that didn't appear on any Syndicate map or Vin star chart. Ahead of them floated an ancient, hollowed-out asteroid, its surface honeycombed with the glowing lights of a hidden civilization. It was a sanctuary for the misplaced, a station where the castaways of a dozen different wars had built a world that didn't care about claims or genetic purity. Jake unbuckled his harness, his muscles aching from the jump. He looked out the viewport at the sprawling, chaotic beauty of the station. It wasn't the clean, sterile silence of his cabin, and it wasn't the rigid hierarchy of the Talon Ares. It was something new. Beside him, Kira sat back, her bronze feathers slightly ruffled, her amber eyes reflecting the distant glow of the asteroid city. She looked at her hands, then at him, the realization of their transition finally settling in. "We are officially ghosts now," she whispered. "To my people, I am dead. To your people, you are a lost file." Jake stood up and offered her his hand, helping her up from the pilot's chair. "Then I guess we're in good company," he said. "Out here, being a ghost just means you get to choose who you want to haunt." Kira tilted her head, a familiar, predatory curiosity sparking in her gaze, but this time it was tempered with a profound sense of peace. She leaned into him, the iridescent shimmer of her feathers brushing against his worn leather jacket. "I think I'd like to start with that conversation we were having," she said. the one about the rain and the wind. As the shuttle drifted toward the docking bay of the asteroid, the view shifted to a small, flickering monitor on the back of the pilot's seat. It was a recording from the cabin's internal security feed, salvaged in the final moments before the jump. The footage showed the two of them standing in the kitchen, surrounded by smoke and broken glass, holding onto each other as the world outside burned. It was a portrait of a moment where the hunter and the hermit had ceased to exist, replaced by something the galaxy hadn't seen in a very long time. Two beings choosing to face the dark together. The screen flickered and died as the shuttle's power diverted to the docking thrusters. The silence of the deep black took over, but it was no longer heavy. It was a blank page. On the frontier, they said that if you ran far enough, you'd eventually fall off the edge of the world. But as Jake and Kira stepped off the ramp and into the bustling, noisy, beautiful chaos of the station, they realized they hadn't fallen. They had simply learned how to fly. The storm was over, the claim was settled, and for the first time in either of their lives, they were exactly where they were supposed to be. The docking bay of the asteroid station, known to the ghosts who lived there as the Reach, hissed with the sound of escaping steam and ancient hydraulics. As the ramp of the Obsidian shuttle lowered for the final time, the air that greeted them wasn't the sterile, filtered oxygen of a Vin cruiser or the biting frost of the frontier. It was thick with the smell of roasting spices, industrial lubricant, and the sweat of 1,000 different species. It was the smell of life, unruly, unmanaged, and free. Jake stepped out first, his boots clanging on the metal grate. He felt the weight of the pulse rifle on his shoulder, and the singed edges of the backpack he had carried across the stars. For the first time in 20 years, he didn't feel the need to look over his shoulder. Behind him, Kira descended the ramp. In this light, away from the violet storms and the red emergency lights of the cockpit, her feathers seemed to glow with a softer, deeper bronze. She looked at the crowds of traders, mechanics, and refugees, her amber eyes wide. She was no longer a pack leader. She was an immigrant to a world without masters. A short, multi-limbed mechanic scurried over, looking at their scarred shuttle with professional curiosity. "Needs a lot of work, that one," the creature chirped in a universal trade dialect. "Iron dust in the intake, plasma scoring on the hull. You coming or going?" Jake looked at Kira. She reached out and laced her clawed fingers through his, her grip certain. "We're staying," she said, her voice steady and clear. The mechanic nodded, tapped a sequence into a handheld pad, and moved on. Jake led Kira toward the main concourse, where the artificial gravity was a little stronger, and the lights of the market stalls blurred into a river of neon. They found a small balcony overlooking the central spire of the asteroid, where the massive thrusters that kept the station in orbit hummed like a distant heart. "You're thinking about the cabin," Kira said softly, sensing the shift in his mood. "Just for a second," Jake admitted. "I spent so much time building walls to keep the galaxy out. I thought the walls were what kept me safe." He turned to her, the glow of the station reflecting in his eyes. "But it turns out, the only thing worth having is someone to stand outside the walls with." Kira leaned her head against his shoulder, her crest rising in a final, peaceful salute. "The others back in the Talon systems. They will tell stories of the Huntress, who was captured by a hermit. They'll say I was lost." She smiled, a sharp, beautiful expression. "But I have never been more found." They stood there for a long time, watching the ships arrive and depart like fireflies in the dark. The Syndicate would keep searching for their genetic prizes, and the Vin packs would keep patrolling their cold, high Ares, but they wouldn't find them here. In the heart of the Reach, among the ghosts and the outcasts, Jake and Kira were no longer a specimen and a hunter. They were simply a man and a woman who had traded the silence for a song. The story of the cabin in the storm was over. The story of the life they would build in the stars was just beginning. And as the station turned slowly in the vast, indifferent void, the two of them walked into the crowd, disappearing into the beautiful, chaotic noise of being alive.